Okay, so here we are. We are doing our Q&A session with Elizabeth Adams, and Elizabeth is the founder of Trustle. Founder? President?
Yes,
Owner?
founder. Yep, co-founder.
Elizabeth is here to talk to us a little bit about parenting during COVID, how to support our children. Again, there's probably a lot of changes there is for us in terms of behavior and things like that. So I know people are struggling. So I'll let you take it away for now.
Okay, thanks. Like Shannon said, I'm Elizabeth. I'm a child psychologist by training. So I've spent the last 15 years working with children and families and supporting parents in traditional settings, in hospitals, in clinical settings. And then when I had my daughter, I sort of joke that my phone became like a parenting hotline, and that was kind of the impetus for Trustle, where I have other professionals on board, and we connect parents to an expert on demand that becomes sort of like having a best friend who's a child psychologist in your pocket, so you can ask any questions that you have. But I love doing events like this and telling people about Trustle, and also just meeting other people in communities and other parents, particularly during this time. I've been taking the opportunity to do some of these workshops around parenting during COVID because, as any parent knows, this is an incredibly challenging time to be a parent. And breaking down sort of the different components of what that means. I have talked to parents recently about how to talk with their kids around what's going on. Also talking to parents about how to manage their own stress and how to help your child regulate and manage their stress during this time. And then certainly like managing and juggling schedules, which is a challenge for everybody right now. So those are kind of the broader things I've been talking to parents about recently. But we just wanted to set this opportunity up so that we could give parents a chance to ask questions they had about this time. And so I can kind of and leave it, like if there's a question people have, I can start tackling those, or if there's a particular area that you want me to expand on, I can definitely do that.
Okay, so that's awesome. I am super excited to have you here because I also get a lot of questions from my clients that I'm just not prepared to answer. So that's also kind of the whole impetus behind opening up Mama Mecca right now. So it seems like most moms are struggling with how to talk to their kids about it and how to deal with staying consistent in a time when we're not sure how long this is our new normal. So where are we drawing boundaries? Where are we laxing on boundaries? And I have some specific questions, but that's sort of, maybe we can go into just that general gist first, and then I can ask some of the more specific questions that I've gotten after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can start with some pointers on how to talk to kids about what's going on. The first thing that I tell parents is that it's really helpful to start with what kids know. And so if your child because it's very different if your child is aware that this is a pandemic where there's a lot of people that are dying. That's very different than a child that might have information like, oh, some people are getting sick. And like, it's interesting. You should really start with like, what's the understanding that your child has by saying like, well, tell me what you know. And because some kids are more aware than we actually really give them credit for. And obviously there's a huge range of understanding. Like I was talking to a parent of a 3-year-old just yesterday, and she was saying her 3-year-old was like standing at the window the other day. And he said, all those bad guys out there are sick. And she was like, and I had this like, uh-oh. And she was like, oh no, buddy, like, it's not bad guys that are sick. And she's like, but he's 3, like, it's confusing for him with what's going on. And like, he sort of had this villain perception of the coronavirus, which makes sense. He's like trying to fit this really complicated thing into his 3-year-old world using schemas and like structures that he knows. And so trying like a good place to start is getting an understanding of the information that your child does have. The second thing when you're talking to your child is being really mindful of your own anxiety when you're having that conversation. And so if we sort of set the emotional thermostat for our kids, and I say, or sometimes I'll say to parents, like, we set the soundtrack. And if the emotional tone is that we're playing like the theme from Jaws while we're talking to them, like that's going to get them anxious and that's going to lead them to be nervous. So we need to be mindful about the tone of the conversation that we're having. And what I often suggest for parents is to start by thinking about how you would explain some of these concepts. And so one of the things that's really fun about being a child psychologist is that I have thought for a long time about how to explain just about any like complicated adult thing you can imagine to young children. Like I've talked to kids about like, you know, parents who have been incarcerated or parents who have died and like you can sex and like, you know, parents who have chosen to be single mothers by choice. Like you can have and should have almost any conversation with any age of child, right? But there is a developmentally appropriate way to do it. And so I think when it comes to COVID, it really varies on like the age and how precocious your child is and what their understanding is to begin with. But you can say to them, like right now, there's a virus that's out in the world and it's making people sick and it spreads, just like how when people have the flu or they have the cold, it can spread. So we're trying to keep everybody safe by staying inside so we don't spread it and make lots of people sick. That is like a sufficient place to start. And then see what questions they have. For some kids, it's going to be like, okay, cool. And like, that's it. For some kids, it's like, but why do we have to stay in the house? And like, why are people wearing masks? And like, the more matter of fact you can be, the better. I think it's also important to focus on the things you can control. Like right now we're staying in our house because that's us being helpers to help make sure that other people can't get sick. Right now we're not seeing Grammy and Grampy and we miss them so much, but because Daddy still has to go to work, we don't want to bring the germs around Grammy and Grampy right now. Like finding ways to kind of explain some of these things and also saying, like my older daughter is, she's 5 and she's very fixated on like if this is going to end by her birthday. And that's really, and it's in May, it's at the end of May. And it's being careful. You don't want to be dismissive. You don't want to say, and you don't want to make promises you can't keep. So the way I've been dealing with that is saying, which is really hard for a 5-year-old, we don't know. We don't know when this is going to go away, but we just have to wait and see. But there are doctors and scientists that are working really hard to try to figure out some medicine to make this better and to make it go away. And we have to see what happens. And like, that's the place to start. I think the other things when you're having these conversations are validating the feelings, not trying to be, kids' worldview is really small. Like if they're upset about not going to the ballet class or having a play date, I think sometimes we might have the tendency to kind of launch in to like, but think of the elderly or like, we can't be selfish. And like your young child doesn't care about that. And that's normal. Like developmentally, toddlers and really young kids are egocentric and their worldview is limited. And that doesn't mean you can't try to explain that to them. But in their moment of disappointment, it's better to join into that moment and like validate that feeling than trying to talk them out of it. So I think that's really important too. It's going to be an evolving dialogue and your kids are going to continue to ask questions. And so one of the things, and this is a good tip in general about talking to things about kids, talking about anything to do, what I'll tell parents is that we often have the tendency to feel like we have to answer our child's questions right away the second they ask. Like we don't. And it's perfectly reasonable to say to a young child, that is such a good question. I want to think about that for a little bit and I'll let you know. Like we don't have to answer right then. I've talked to parents who have gone through really complicated divorces with their significant others, and they're like, sometimes my child will just throw a question at me that I'm like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I'm like, then don't answer in that moment. It's okay. In this moment, too, if your child asks you a question and you're feeling anxious about how to respond, to say, like, that's a great question. I'm going to think about it and come back to you. But do circle back and give them that answer later.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's I'm like sitting here taking notes because I'm also fielding questions coming at me, when I'm in the middle of work or even having a call with a client. So that's really helpful for me. And I love the idea of meeting them where they're at. I have this tendency to try to, just start explaining. And so I like, it kind of reminds me, my brother's little girl came up to him and said, "Where do babies come from?" And he was like, or how are babies made? And he was like, "Oh, well, when two people love each other." And she was like, no. Is it with tape or with glue? And he was like, "Oh, yeah, glue." And she was like, "Okay, thanks." And like went away. So he was like, "Okay, I need to understand what my kids are asking." So I think
exactly.
Great. Okay, so that's awesome. And the next questions are, they all kind of follow the same theme that I had mentioned, which is like, what are we doing about staying consistent and developing behavioral habits, based on sort of our general parenting. So the first one is, my son is 8 years old and is having bigger outbursts than normal. Which I can relate to. And he's being meaner to his older sister, and he's not listening when we're trying to give consequences or even just sit him down and talk about it. So I have this question too. Like, what do we, are we trying to say, now this is a new normal, we have to find a whole new approach, or are we kind of being lax? What do you think?
Well, I think so. The first thing I think that's really important to understand is that type of escalation of behavior is exactly what we would expect from this, right? It's a stressful situation. And it's also hard for our kids too. Like that's currently like my personal mantra when I'm having a moment where like I'm really frustrated as a parent, I'm wearing my parenting hat. Like the first thing I try to think is like, this is hard for them too. And we know from research on when kids' routines are thrown off, or when we look at past examples of huge disruption to kids' lives, we don't have a situation that's exactly like this. But when we look at things like, kids that have been in natural disasters, when we look at kids' adjustment, like post-Katrina and things like that, what we know is that there are a certain presentation for kids. So there's increased anxiety. There's increased externalizing behavior, so more tantrums and things like that. It's normal to see play themes around illness or dying or aggression. There's a decrease in concentration or attention for kids. There's changes in sleep and appetite. There's regressions. There can be nightmares. And also feelings of just kind of being upset at missing events or friends or school. And so I think that all of these things it's important to keep in mind the acuity that kids are facing right now, even if it doesn't seem like kids don't express, they don't have the ability to say like, this is really hard for me and I'm confused. The way that they show that is by externalizing. And so I think it's really important to have an understanding of what's going on. And I think that it requires a level of grace for everybody, for parents, and for kids. And I mean, you think about that laundry list of presentation I just said, and then it's like, oh yeah, parents, like now's a great time where you're suddenly also going to like become teachers for your kids in your home, and we're going to do distance learning plans, when I just said like they can't concentrate and their attention is limited and their behavior is escalated. Like, sounds like a good idea. Like, it's a nightmare. And it's really, really challenging. And I think they're like, so it depends when the battle is happening and what it's about. Like, I've had a lot of conversations with parents around the distance learning stuff. And I'm like, honestly, if a child isn't available to learn because they're super stressed, like, we should not be treating this like there is an academic crisis happening. Like, it's far more important to meet their emotional need and find other ways for them to learn that can be more engaging and also less pressure. Like, this would not be the time that I personally would suggest that a parent get into a power struggle for hours a day with their child over distance learning. Like, I don't think that that's fair to the child or the parent. I've had other parents say things around like, so should all the rules kind of go out the window? And I don't think we should do that either. Like, I think that there's a healthy balance. And it's funny because I was doing a webinar about this, and I was kind of thinking about this very question that you were asking me. And there are a few tips that I give parents when I have a general like positive parenting workshop that I give. And I was thinking about how some of those apply now, like more than ever. And there are three in particular that I've pulled out that I've been reinforcing to parents and saying, like, these are the three sort of guiding principles that I think we should keep in mind that are important now more than ever before. The first is the power of like connection in 5 minutes. And what I'm talking about there is research actually tells us that when we spend 5 minutes of child-directed interaction, or special, you can call it special time with a child, it actually significantly improves behavior across the board, particularly for kids that are 2 to 7. And what's interesting is when I tell parents that fact, most parents are like, I spend way more than 5 minutes with my kid, Elizabeth. Like, what are you talking about? And it's because it's what you're doing during that 5 minutes. So most of the time when we're spending time with our kids, we are also cooking dinner. Now we are also working. We are doing laundry. We're texting on our phone. We're multitasking while we're hanging out with our kids. Or it's a parent-directed interaction. We are telling our kids to set the table. We're telling them to brush their teeth. We're giving them commands. If you can find 5 minutes where you actually let your child be in charge, like, what do you want to do for 5 minutes? And like, not turn that into baby teacher time where you then ask your child to spell words and ask them what color things are and what things are called, because those are commands. Instead, you really let your child lead that interaction. That gives them some sense of control and agency. I think with older kids, that plays into the same concept in a different way: control and agency. If you're trying to set a distance learning schedule, let your child pick the order. With my older daughter, I've been doing like the things that I know she would be a little more resistant to. I've been putting like green dots next to, and the things that she would want to do: outside time, free time, snack, whatever. They get playtime. Those get blue dots. And I'm like, we're going to do one green dot, one blue dot, one green dot, one blue dot. But she gets to pick what green dot we're doing, and she gets to pick what blue dot we're doing. So giving kids some control makes them more amenable, and that reduces the number of power struggles to begin with. So that's one, like finding time to connect and giving your child agency. The second thing is choosing your commands carefully. So there is some research that shows how often we give commands to kids. And in a 10-minute time frame, kids are typically told and asked 17 commands and 29 questions in a 10-minute time frame of high transition. And what's kind of remarkable, high transitions are usually like trying to get ready in the morning, trying to get ready at night, whatever. But what's amazing, there's a couple things that are kind of amazing about that. The first is, if that were any adult that were getting that level of commands, like it would drive us crazy. Like we would go nuts if we had a boss that were giving us commands in that frequency. We have all universally as parents had the experience of being asked 29 commands or 29 questions in 10 minutes. That is something parents can relate to. And it's a frustrating experience. It's a frustrating experience for our kids too. But the behaviorist in me, the person that studies child behavior, knows also there's zero chance parents are being consistent with 17 commands in 10 minutes. Like it's not happening. And what it means is we're repeating commands a ton of times, or we're throwing out a bunch of commands that we don't mean. And this turns into when we give commands at that high of a level, of that high of a frequency, kids have to figure out which commands they really need to listen to. And they figure that out by something that parents do, and it's usually the volume of the parent's voice. And this ends up feeding the thing where parents inevitably come to me and say, why does nobody listen unless I yell? And the reason for that is that the yelling becomes the clue that that's the command they should listen to. So the first thing that I tell parents generally, but especially now, is choose your commands carefully. Decide the things that you really care about and make those your commands, and be aware of how often you're telling your child to not do something or to stop do something. You want to save those for when it really matters. And ultimately, there's sort of a decision tree, when it comes to certain things, and exactly how you respond kind of depends on a number of factors, and there's not a right or wrong. Like I was talking to a parent that was struggling around screen time right now with her child. And I was like, okay, so there's a couple of things we can do. We can try to orchestrate the environment so that we're setting up schedules, we're putting in timers, we're having certain times during the day, right? There's those things that are hopefully going to help. But most kids are still going to try to push that boundary. That's what they do. So then we come to the second point, decision point, which is how do we respond in the moment when they push the boundary? And there's a couple different ways to respond, and how to respond appropriately depends on a number of things. One, how much do you care? Like I said to this mom, tell me, is this where you want to go to the mat? If it's not, you have my full permission for it to be not to where you go to the mat, right? Like that's a choice. Deciding you don't care about this is a choice. But I would decide that ahead of time and build that expectation in beforehand. If you decide this is a limit and I'm going to tell my child that this is a boundary because this is one of my commands that I'm going to give, this is a limit that I'm going to set, then I do think it's important to stay consistent with the boundary, but choose that very carefully. Now, how you choose to discipline or hold that limit really depends on your child, really depends on your parenting style, any number of things. You can say, like, I'm really sorry that you're sad, and hold your child through the tantrum if you want to, and not give them the iPad. Like, that's a choice. You can choose to walk away from that tantrum and say, I'm sorry that you're sad. You'll have iPad time tomorrow. Or, you can choose to have a consequence for that. I would say for most parents, it's not where you want to have a consequence. The consequence is not having it in the first place and letting them work through that emotion. And that's okay. But you have to decide as a parent if you feel comfortable holding that boundary. I do think when it comes to more emotional outbursts, more tantrums, there's sort of a similar process where it turns into how can we orchestrate our environment, help regulate the child if there's anything we can do? Is it too much academic time? Are they not getting enough attention? Like, what are the things we can do to stop it? And then knowing we might not be able to. We might not be able to stop it, and they're going to have this emotional reaction. The other big thing is the third one is talking about emotions and processing, not in the heat of the moment. That's a good parenting tip in general. Like, and a lot of times parents get confused because they're like, well, I've heard about emotion coaching. And with really young kids, you can label an emotion. Like, you're really frustrated right now. But trying to talk your child, if you've never introduced deep breathing before, they're not going to learn how to deep breathe through a tantrum in the middle of a tantrum. Like, never in the history of ever has that worked. When people are upset and dysregulated, adults too, our frontal lobe is completely hijacked, and we do not have the ability to reason and logic and think. That goes triple for kids. And so you cannot logic and talk a child when they are dysregulated. You can be a holding space for them, but you want to teach those regulation skills when they're calm, not when they're upset. Teach them about deep breathing, teach them about labeling emotions, teach them about using their words when they are not in that moment. Similarly, if you're like, my kid is totally dysregulated and upset right now, the time to try to talk to them about it isn't then. So deal with that as you normally would. If they're being aggressive and they need to be, removed from a situation, deal with that as you normally would. Or if you hold them through that situation, that's fine. Or if you say you need to go to your room until you have a safe body, that's fine. Probably depends on the age and who the child is and the particular parent. But afterwards, strike when the iron is cold. Afterwards, say to that child, it seems like you've been having like a really big feeling. That makes sense. This is hard. Let's talk about this. Not in the middle of the moment. And so I think those are the three big things to kind of think about. There is an increased need for understanding and grace and flexibility, but I do think that we should still have structure and expectations for our kids, because those are actually regulating, and you do want some boundaries.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that those are all things that, for me, it helps to hear kind of like all together, because I think I'm like, oh yeah, I should do this and I should do this. And they're all kind of like what you're saying, but really kind of having a very specific approach, at least for me, makes a lot more sense in my head when I can say, okay, decide beforehand if I'm going to hold my ground. I think that's a good one, because I think I tend to approach it like, well, I just said it. Do I hold my ground or do I not? Like, he's saying no. Do I let him say no to me? I don't know. I don't really care, but also I don't want him to be
sad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's like an in the moment thing where it's like, brush your teeth. No, I want to finish coloring my picture. If you can very quickly decide, okay, you can finish coloring your picture. Like, I think that's fine. But I think if you start down a path, you need to be aware, but it's the awareness. And it's the cousin, for me, it's like the cousin of, let me think about that question and get back to you. I will often, like, my daughter knows, I will often say, like, let me think about it for a minute when she asks me something, because I'll use with parents, like, we want our no's and our yeses to be reliable. Like, that's it. If they're not reliable, at the end of the day, our kids see our no as like, well, now we've opened the table for negotiations. I see you're starting at a no. Like, and they're going to push back on that. If they know, like, sometimes if I throw a really good tantrum, I can turn that no into a yes. Like that, they learn that over time. And I think sometimes we have these knee-jerk reactions where we'll say no to something that we don't really care about, and then they'll escalate, and then we say yes. And then you get into a situation where your child goes to the escalation more quickly because they're like, I know how to get from a no to a yes, and it's some sort of escalation. And like, I tell parents, if you're exhausted, it's not a great analogy now because we're not out in the stores with our kids anymore. But if you're exhausted and your child is like, Mommy, I want this candy bar or whatever, and you're like, no, and then they escalate and you say yes, like that's teaching them something. And like, it is okay to have a moment as a parent. I think personally, it's better if you can be like, let me think about it. And if you're like, today is not the day, to just say yes. Like I always tell this story. I was across the street from my daughter's school at a parent teacher, like back to school night thing. And we went into CVS and there was probably 30 parents from her school in this CVS. And there was these like obnoxious lollipops at the counter. And my daughter was like, they were like big and like, I don't know how long, they had probably been there for like 10 years. And my daughter was like, can I have one of those? And there's like this audience of parents, and like, when you're the psychologist, they're like, how's she going to do this one? And like waiting to see. And I was like, am I going to stand my ground if she tries to escalate? And I was like, the answer was no, I wasn't. And so I said, sure, you can have the lollipop because it wasn't worth it to me in that moment. And I didn't want to say no and then have her escalate and then say yes. And I also wasn't willing to go all the way to the mat for it. So the answer was yes. And she took 3 licks of it and threw it in the trash can. And that was the end of it because I'm sure it was gross. And I like still stand by that $5 lollipop and that decision in that moment because it was the right one for me. So I think especially right now when we're stressed, we might end up saying yes a little bit more. Our boundaries might be relaxed, but you want to say it and stick to what you say. But it's okay to think about that consciously and do the parent gut check of like, is this the battle I want to pick right now?
That's a huge thing for me, at least, because I feel very strongly, like you said, that I can't back down once I've put my foot down about something. And where I think I go wrong and where this whole COVID thing has me like, man, we're together all the time. He's also asking, he's very needy. Once I put my foot down, like, how much am I going to fight for it? And so I think that check-in of, do I want to fight? Am I willing to fight? Is good because I think at least we're getting is we're fighting. He's reacting big because I'm not letting him we're in a power struggle all the time.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful for me. At least I'm getting something out of this. But I think that really answers that question really well. And I think you really did kind of answer the other questions that we have here. One was about, how do we structure our learning in a way that feels good both for the parent and the amount of time they have to spend and for the kids. So we had a couple questions about that. And I think you answered that pretty well, unless you have anything else you want to expand on.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so tricky about this. Am I freezing, Shannon?
It was frozen for a second.
You're freezing.
It was for a second, but it's fine now, hopefully.
Okay. I think what's really challenging is that it's oh, sorry, you guys are frozen for me. But I don't know if that's on my end.
You're still coming through clear.
Yeah.
You're coming through clear.
Okay. But we can hear you well.
Okay, sorry about that. So I think the important thing, or what's really tricky about this, is that everybody's circumstances are so different. And then like what people want from their schools then in turn is really different. I know, at my daughter's school, there are some parents that, have been furloughed, unfortunately, or they are parents that stay at home, or they have support. And for them, like, they're very hungry for a long, detailed, like, curriculum. There are other parents that I know where both the parents are still working full time, or they're single parents that are also working from home that don't have additional help. And they're like, it's a miracle if I can get an hour in. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge a few things. Like, if you have the ability and you have a child that needs a high level of structure and you want to structure your day from start to finish, like, okay, that's great, you know. But I also think it's important for parents that don't have the capability to do that to recognize and differentiate routine and predictability from a schedule. Like, what kids crave is some sort of predictability right now, but that doesn't mean it has to be like a color-coded detailed schedule that's 8 hours long. Like, even if you just have benchmarks that are a skeleton, like, and you don't, like, I have a schedule that I follow with my daughter because she really wants that, but there's not a single time on that schedule because that would make me crazy and like make her crazy and feel like this unnecessary pressure. So if something doesn't take the exact amount of time, who cares? But like, that's us. So I think you have to know yourself and you have to know your child. And I think it's also worth recognizing that most kids in elementary school aren't going to do more than an hour or two of highly focused academic work. The average elementary school child has an attention span of 25 minutes. That's it. Like, that's normal. And when kids are in school, they're not getting intensive, somebody sitting right next to them, one-on-one instruction for hours on end. They have lunch and breaks and specials and socializing time and time where they're sitting there when their teachers are helping somebody else. And so I think it's worthwhile to recognize those pieces. If possible, chunking time is really helpful. For me, it's about 80% successful. So I have said to my work, like, from 9 to 1, I am with my daughter while my husband is still, unfortunately, because he's an essential employee, he's working outside the home between those hours. 9 to 1, I'm with her. Then I'm working 2 to 6. Then I'm working 8 to 11 again. And it's not great, but, I'm exhausted, but like, blocking that time is important because it helps you know where your mental focus is going to be when. And it's interesting because I do a workshop on parenting triggers. And one of the biggest parenting triggers is multitasking, right? And if you think about it, when a child is pushing your buttons, there's two sides to that equation. There's the child's behavior or whatever they're doing that's pushing your button. And there's what does the button look like, right? And if your body is a big, giant, glowing button that's like flashing push me, that the slightest graze is going to set it off, that we have to fix that side of the button. And one of the biggest things that makes that button very, very pushable is multitasking. If you've ever been writing an email and you have had a child doing this over your shoulder, you know that your response is like, just a minute, more quickly than it should be, because multitasking makes us anxious and frustrated, and it's hard. And if we are spending the next 2 months or month, or I don't know, hopefully it's shorter than that, however long it is, trying to multitask for multiple hours a day, we're going to be a walking button. So if you can chunk time of like, this is the time I'm going to focus on my kids, this is the time I'm going to focus on my work, it's going to help alleviate that. It's not perfect. I still have work calls scheduled in my teaching time, and my daughter has to get screen time then or whatever, they're fighting, or I'm saving somebody's life from choking or whatever it is while I'm on a conference call. Like, it's not perfect, but it's something to try to block the time. So I think those are the other pieces that I would think about.
Yeah, I'm so mean when I'm working or like, and then the problem I think I struggle with is I do multitask a lot. And so I'll be on my phone where it probably doesn't look very important, but I'm like answering something that needs to be dealt with immediately. And my son is talking to me and then I feel horrible, like he just sees me on my phone, but I have to finish this. And then I'm just like yelling at him and
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this situation like pulls us, because I'm guilty of it too. Like you're like, okay, for 2 seconds she's coloring. Let me see if I can answer some emails. And you get pulled into that because you're like anything not to work until 11 o'clock every night. And like, but then it's a setup because then they're asking for that. So it's really trying, and it's no one's going to do this perfectly, but it's that bringing to awareness, like, why am I snapping more? Could it be this? And like, can I draw some boundaries around this? And how might I be able to do this? Even if it's imperfect, if it can be a slight improvement, I think that's going to help our collective mother sanity. So any small improvement we'll take at this point.
Yeah, I love that. Our first call for this Mama Mecca was with a time blocking specialist.
Uh-huh.
And so she really was nailing that down and just saying, hey, you have to have every little thing on a calendar and then you move it instead of just like, well, can't do that now. So I found
Yeah.
that hugely helpful. So that's huge. And I think it's a really good reminder, even for me, having just taken her workshop, I still am like, okay, no, this is good. I need to be more rigid in that block. So that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one more question here, but again, I think you kind of answered it, and then maybe Nicole has a question or two. But this is one about a 3-year-old who is climbing into the bed most nights since this COVID. And so obviously it sounds like a regression. So, and I think you kind of touched on that. Do you allow it? Do you say, okay, I don't want this to be a habit again? So what do you think of things like that?
I think if I was working with a parent, and this actually has come up a fair bit, we help parents with sleep challenges. It's one of our most common. Behavior and sleep are two common challenges that we help parents with on Trustle. And I have seen a major spike in parents asking for sleep help. I go back to that decision tree that starts with an honest conversation with the parent around, okay, let's think of the pros and cons. Like neither choice is perfect, right? Do you want to hold the line, and how are we going to set the limit around not co-sleeping? That might feel really hard right now because your child's anxious. But I think it's also okay to hold that line. I would not tell parents that I think they're going to do damage to their child because they hold a line like that during this time. Like that's not true. So I would try to ease parents' anxiety. However, if I have a parent that says to me, I'm now working 13-hour days, I do not have it in me to get up and be consistent, then I'll say, okay, roll over and snuggle, like fine by me, knowing that at some point you'll probably want to change this and it might be harder, but kids can unlearn anything. Like we can course correct at any point. So like it doesn't have to be today. Might it be hard? It can be hard now or it can be hard later. But if you don't have the capacity or the space to set that limit and be consistent right now, that's okay. And then it might be, is there an in between? Or I actually had a mom the other day, a week ago, her child started doing that. And she's like, I don't have the energy. I'm going to just enjoy it. And like, we're going to co-sleep for now. And I'll call you back for a plan of how to deal with this later. And I'm like, okay, you have my like full support. She messaged her Trustle coach last night and was like, he's kicking me. I can't sleep. He's moving all around the bed. This is actually like a nightmare and it's worse. Like I'm not sleeping with him in the bed and this is not fun. And it was like, okay, like now we got to do this plan. And so I think, as we know, like parenting is messy, but I would be remiss to say like you should always hold that line or you should totally let that line go. Like it kind of depends on where you are and what energy you have and how it looks for your family. Because there's always a way to change it. And if that's supporting a parent now and holding that line, there's also 5 different ways to do that. You know, depending on the age of the child, you can use positive reinforcement. You can do it gently and fade out. You know, there's other things that you can do. Um, you know, and same with, or, you know, letting it go. If that works great for a family, that's awesome. If it causes more sleep disruption, that's not so great. So I think it really depends.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I love hearing you say you can course correct anytime. I think that's where my anxiety at least lives is like, oh my God, I'm gonna, set a pace for future decisions forever, and he's gonna
Yeah.
always have this personality if I allow him this space, or, they're always gonna sleep with me if I don't take care of it now. Um, or asking for cuddles before bed, which they're doing a lot more now, which is like, I just can't, I have so much to do, but like also, I just can't fight it either. So, but
Yeah.
creating a bad habit. So I
Right.
think
You end
great
up
to
sort of
hear you say,
spiraling.
yeah,
Yeah.
that if you can
Yeah. Absolutely.
course correct anytime. I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
think this
yeah.
has been
Oh,
so helpful for me anyway. And I think it'll be really great to share with the community. I think I'm in so many moms groups on Facebook and my own community. And so we're all just kind of like, what do we do? This is all so hard. So thank you so
it's
much. This
really
is
good. Absolutely. And if anybody is interested in checking out Trustle, they can go to our website. It's trustle.com and it's spelled Trustle.com. And if somebody wants more individualized support or coaching to like talk through some of those moments that are really individual, as I was saying, like there's not one right way for every family. So if you want a more individualized approach, Trustle can help with that. And we have a promotion running right now that I can tell your community about, where if you use the code HAPPY, HAPPY, you can get $40 off a plan, which is cool. So, yeah. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to let us know about or upcoming um, anything that you've
I
got
don't
going
think
on?
so. I want, you know, parents to know that this, if they feel like this is a really hard time, it's not because they're doing something wrong. It's because this is a really hard time. And it's, you know, the task that we're being asked to do is incredibly challenging. And, you know, it's really tough. So just giving, I think, ourselves some grace in this situation too. It's a really tough time to be a parent.
Well, anybody who's listening can send me questions, and I think we will definitely, hopefully, have Elizabeth back on here for another Q&A. So I can stockpile some more questions for you, and we can do this again sometime. I think
Wow.
things will change again. So
I'd
uh,
love to. Well,
great.
thank you.